Content warning. Episodes of Grey Matter may contain themes and depictions of extreme mental illness, traumatic bodily harm, and death. If you aren't in the right headspace to engage with those depictions right now, maybe this episode should wait for another time. Otherwise, proceed with caution.
Hey there, you're back quicker than usual. That last tape must have really had you hooked, huh? Well, no point in wasting any more time, but before I give you the next tape, I have another question for you. One that might seem deceptively simple on the surface, but one whose true answer will help put the next step of your journey into proper focus. What has one eye and three legs? An alien tripod? Oh, I'm sorry, that's incorrect. The answer we were looking for is a camera. Cameras, like mirrors, show us what we are, as honestly as they can from wherever we set them up. They show us ourselves from the outside, lay us bare as creatures of quiet habit and hidden intentions, and let our actions speak for themselves. Moments of crisis have a way of doing that too. As you might have guessed, this tape is called War of the Worlds Part 2, and it's a story told in 3 acts. 3 familiar faces on 3 separate journeys through a world without order, but not one without consequences. Previously on Grey Matter.
Morning, Kay.
Good morning, Mr. Ogilvy. What's going on over there?
Oh, a meteor fell last night during that shower. Smack dab in the middle of the park.
How's your wife?
She gets confused. She knows she trusts me, but sometimes she doesn't quite know who I am.
There you are. Hurry up and get back here. We're selling more food than a Walmart. I'm running myself ragged covering for a lazy ass at home. I can't do it at work, too.
Come on. It's not Dean's fault he can't work.
You're right. It's the mines. Something for you to look forward to if Matt doesn't get out of there. Hey, you're here doing that environmental survey, right? Mr.
Cooper. His name's Jimmy Cooper.
Jim,
So what do you think of Forest Hill?
I think you've got a nice little town here. It's kind of all-American, you know?
Well, Mr. Ogilvy, is it a meteor?
I don't know what it is.
Is it alive?
We have to get out of here!
What about the others?
Michelle took off running. Cooper's... I don't know, he's gone. If we stay here, we're gonna die.
I have to go home to Sarah.
Go to your wife, Mr. Ogilvy.
Thank you. Good luck.
I must have thought that no matter how bad things got, the world could still be saved. But looking at it now, I knew, whatever else this world was, it wasn't ours anymore.
War of the Worlds, Part 2. Purgatory. Written and directed by Jonathan Inbody, and adapted from the novel The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Act 1. The Economist.
God damn it, Dean.
Sorry. Did I wake you up again?
Yeah, it's not even. It's barely 4:30.
I'm sorry, Michelle.
Just go back to sleep. It was Friday, and I was up before the sun, same as it ever was. I could still hear Dean breathing as I made my coffee, toasted a Pop-Tart, and sat down in front of the television. And I couldn't drown it out no matter how loud I turned up the volume. There was footage from all over the world playing on the news. Bright streaks and bursts in the sky, meteors falling to Earth and the heavens glowing. They interviewed some nutjob who said it was an alien invasion. And he pointed to the rolling blackouts in Europe and Africa as proof. What an idiot. After I ate, I showered and got dressed, then headed down to the diner in time to meet the short-order cook. I hadn't had time to finish the inventory the night before, but it didn't matter all that much. It was a busy morning, with a steady stream of locals in and out, all buzzing about the crater in the middle of the park. There was something kind of compelling to it, or at least the idea of it, but I couldn't be bothered to care. How could I? I was 38 years old with no kids and a stay-at-home husband that hobbled around with an oxygen tank while I sweat myself to death handing out scrambled eggs. I had no future, hardly any past, and less than no prospects. And Dean, that son of a bitch, was lucky enough to be dying. Once Kay got there, late, she set herself to talking with that stuffed shirt asshole that came to check the town's water. He looked at her, smiled as he made idle conversation, and why wouldn't he? She was young, pretty, with a whole life ahead of her. Her boyfriend, Matt, was a man who knew how lucky he was, and he knew how to treat her like it. Dean could hardly get out of bed. When Ogilvy called everyone out to come look at a rock, I went along for the variety more than anything. It was better than the diner, better than the dead-end town and the trailer park. It was something to hope for, maybe. Proof that things really could change. And you could bet your ass they did.
Well, Mr. Ogilvy? Is it a meteor? Or a spaceship?
I don't know what it is.
Well, don't keep us in suspense.
I looked back from the diner to the crater as the crowd moved in around me. They were everywhere. Wide-eyed kids, nervous mothers, and overconfident fathers. Even a few scattered dogs. And when that thing rose out of the crater like an obsidian pillar, the mood changed on a dime. After a bright flash, someone screamed and everyone began to move, shoving past each other in a sudden, aimless stampede. Cooper was pushed through the crowd into my side, almost knocking me over as he struggled to keep his balance. His face was pale, nearly pure white, and there was terrified sweat forming on his brow.
It's alive! Oh, we gotta get out of here.
What is it?
I don't know. An alien? A monster? I think it's an invertebrate.
What?
No, never mind.
He turned and took off running, almost immediately disappearing in a flurry of heads, legs, and elbows. As the shape in the crater got taller and taller, blocking out the sunlight from across the park, I had a sudden moment of horrible clarity. That idiot on the news was right. We were under attack. We were being invaded. There would be destruction, casualties, chaos. Enough that making any sense of it would be damn near impossible. I took off running for the trailer park, tearing off my apron on the way. An opportunity like this couldn't be wasted. A day where life really could change in an instant. Dean was looking out the window when I got to the trailer, and I think I scared him half to death when I flung open the door.
Michelle, what the hell's going on out there?
The end of the world, maybe, but we've got to move.
What?
Don't ask questions, just come on. There's no time to pack a bag. Take the oxygen tank and let's go. I rushed him outside and helped him into the passenger seat of his rusted old truck, then got into the driver's seat and started it. The engine rattled, rumbled, and finally turned over. And in seconds, we were peeling out through the trailer park towards town.
Why are we going this way? That's where all the screams are coming from.
Dean, baby, do you trust me?
Yeah.
Then don't ask questions. All right, fine. I've been saving money up. I hid it under my desk at the diner.
Why were you hiding money?
That doesn't matter now, all right? But we've got to go get it. We're gonna need to pay somebody to get us out of here. A ferry or a plane or something, all right?
Where are we going?
Anywhere but here.
I guess that makes... Holy shit, look out! You almost hit that guy!
Well, then he shouldn't have been in the road. We pulled up to the diner and screeched to a stop. In the park, a huge three-legged thing was destroying everything. People, cars, even buildings when its aim wasn't dead on. I ran around to the side of the truck and opened the passenger side door, then started to help Dean with the seatbelt.
Wait a minute. Why am I... Just go get the money and let's get out of here.
No, I need you with me, because what if there's looters?
Looters?
Yeah, to rob the register, or...
There's no money, is there?
No, there is, but I need you to...
Stop. Just stop. Are you trying to get me killed?
What? No.
Did you take out life insurance on me or something?
Dean, your lungs are Swiss cheese. No one would insure you.
Did you try?
Just stop talking crazy and get out of the truck.
What? No. Don't. Hey, let go of me.
You worthless! Why are you even fighting? I'm doing you a favor.
Get off me, you crazy bitch! Oh, hell.
I looked up, squinting as the bright sunlight gleamed off the side of the gigantic thing looming over us. Its giant eye was staring down, looking through me like the eye of God, and I felt my knees get weak as I tried to think of anything to say. A dark, twisting shape lashed down with a glittering point at its tip, and I barely felt it as it stabbed straight through the front of my ribs and out the other side. I looked over at Dean, considering for the first time in a long time how lucky I'd been to have him, and felt my body get yanked into the sky as if by a bungee cord. I was flying, at least for a second, before the tentacle swung up and pushed me through a fold of flesh into the massive thing's body. They pulled the stinger out of my chest and I dropped to the wet floor, then rolled down a slimy tube and landed with a splash in a pitch-black chamber. I heard someone moan, out in the dark, and I reached both hands out to find them, pressing my palms up against a squishy, balloon-lined surface on one side. The liquid rising up around my ankles to my knees was starting to burn, and it sizzled like carbonation in a freshly opened soda can. I bumped into something, and as my eyes started to adjust to the dark, I crouched down to get a better look, even though it stung my knees to do it. It was a body, torn in half and deformed like smashed clay. Someone screamed, only a few feet away, and I staggered towards the sound, my legs knocking against more floating shapes as I went. They were tingling all over, and the moisture seemed to have already soaked through my jeans. I reached the far end of the wide, damp room and looked down at a hunched-over woman, screaming as the liquid sloshed around her. Suddenly, she whirled around and grabbed my shirt and pulled herself towards me as she let out another blood-curdling scream. Her legs were dangling behind her as shriveled, burning stumps, and the skin was dripping off her face and her hands like runny eggs, but there was just enough of her tongue left that I could understand her final words. "Kill me," she said. "Please." And as the acid started to eat through my skin and soak into the muscles in my legs, I began to understand why. For so long, I had thought my life was hell. But as the minutes passed and more of me dripped off and burned away, as I choked on the smell of bubbling flesh and went deaf with echoing screams, I realized that before today, I didn't know what hell was. The last thing I heard was Dean's cough, somewhere off in the dark, and the last thing I felt were my fingers turning to liquid as I tried to drag myself towards him. How could I have been so goddamn wrong? Hell isn't other people. Hell is dying alone.
Act 2. The Biologist.
It was Friday, and I was up entirely too early. I was in some shitty hotel in a quaint little town called Horse Hill, which was currently being hollowed out and poisoned by the mine that provided jobs for half the locals, and it was my job to break the bad news to them. I didn't know that the water was dangerous to drink, at least not for sure, but I had been in enough little towns with enough powerful companies to know what to expect. And if I did my job right, then at least the locals would have some data to point their lawyers to when they all got cancer in 30 years. When I was a kid, I'd wanted to be a zookeeper. Looking back, I think I might have liked that a lot more. After a sulfur water shower, I went for breakfast at some greasy little diner I kept passing on my way back and forth across town. It was small, somewhere near charming, and I made conversation with a local science teacher before being cross-examined by the waitresses. Soon enough, the four of us were standing around a smoldering hole in the ground in the middle of Horse Hill Park. It was a halfway decent way to pass the morning, at least in the absence of anything important to do, and I had to admit, I was curious about what was inside.
Well, Mr. Ogilvy? Is it a meteor? Or a spaceship?
I don't know what it is.
Well, don't keep us in suspense. The waitress beside me stepped forward, and I followed. The crowd, too, leaned in, all eager to see the thing in the crater that Ogilvy was poking at. The other waitress, or the owner, was barely paying attention, staring back at the diner as the crowd circled, and after a second, I couldn't see her anymore. Past the old man's shoulders and head, a pulsing, twitching thing sat in the middle of the smoldering pit.
I don't think this is a good idea.
Is it alive? I did my undergrad in biology. Should I... The next minute, was it only a minute, will stay with me until the day that I die. I stared at the swelling, wriggling thing in the crater, taking in every detail I could make out as the old man shrank back. It looked like a pufferfish, a frog, an octopus, 1,000 semi-aquatic creatures all smashed together into a huge living balloon. It was beautiful, impossible. Living, breathing proof of a life beyond ours. To me, it looked something like an angel. The old man started to caterwaul, and the waitress and I pulled him out of the crater. But on his way up, he kicked the bizarre thing in the side of the head. It reacted, stiffening and thinning in a defensive posture, and as it started rising, steam issued out from inside its wet, leathery flesh. A million thoughts shot through my mind in an instant. Did it move its limbs with internal hydraulic pressure, like a spider? And if it came from some great ocean, did it fill its boneless, blubbery body with gas to propel itself through the water? Is that how it had traveled here? The creature's pinhole eyes widened to reveal bulging bags of bioluminescent liquid sloshing around inside its head, and as they glowed brighter and brighter, I became suddenly aware of the danger. If this thing was an animal, we were staring at a threat display. The creature's face pulsed, flash frying some poor bastard in front of it. And as the crowd started to panic, so did I. In the chaos, I ran into the other waitress and nearly bowled her over. It's alive! Oh, we gotta get out of here.
What is it?
I don't know. An alien? A monster? I think it's an invertebrate, but asymmetrical, like a squid with semi-articulated cartilage limbs.
What?
Oh, never mind. I took off running, shoving aside terrified yokels as I headed for my car, and by the time I reached it, the smell of burning flesh was spreading out of the park and across town. I pulled out of my parking spot on the street, swerving around a fleeing family, and as I tore towards the bridge leading out of town, I glanced up at my rearview mirror. Behind me, a gigantic black shape was rising in the park, like a vertical battleship with a crab shell skull. Its armored surface glittered purple in the morning sun, and the lens at its front had the opaque look of a thick fingernail. The shape was eerily familiar. It was that thing from the crater. Not an invertebrate, but a complex arthropod, a hermit crab, and a living machine. Clouds of white hot steam billowed out underneath it as it rose on 3 twisted legs, and when its eyes began to glow, I forced myself to look back at the road. Screams and explosions echoed out behind me as I turned onto the bridge and started to cross the river, swerving around the other panicking drivers all around me. Then, suddenly, my car was consumed by a burst of blinding light. In a second, I was falling, surrounded by chunks of concrete and melted rebar. My car fell hood first and slammed into the water, instantly pulverizing the engine as the car started to sink into the river. By some miracle, the windshield hadn't broken. The vehicle sank down through the dark water as cars and concrete debris rained down around me, then settled flat in the vast expanse of the riverbed and sent a cloud of mud swirling up around the windows. When it cleared, I could see one bank of the river a few hundred yards in front of me, and the second, a little closer, behind me. The car shifted and groaned as the water pressed in, flexing against the thin windows, and suddenly my reason caught up to sheer animal panic. I was underwater, surrounded by the remains of a collapsed bridge and 10 or 20 identical cars. I had survived, for now, but it might have been only for a few extra minutes. I looked out my passenger window as an SUV plunged upside down to the bottom of the river. As it hit bottom, the top of the car was instantly crushed, and I looked away as I saw the dark bodies inside begin to flail and struggle. When I looked back, not even a minute later, the dark shapes were still, only moving when the current swayed them. Ahead of me, a woman in a small car was slamming 2 bloody hands against her driver's side window, cutting her fingers to ribbons as she tried to pull apart the cracked glass. Suddenly, the window gave, and a wall of water slammed her down and out of sight as the car flooded. In a few seconds, all I could see were the headlights. I felt my panicked breaths and my heaving shoulders, my heartbeat hammering in my chest, and I tried to take stock of myself. I was uninjured, at least as far as I could tell, except for the swelling bruise on the side of my forehead and what felt like a pulled muscle in my leg. I must have tried to twist out of my seat on the way down, hyperextended it without realizing. I leaned my head forward and tilted it up to look at the remains of the bridge at the top of the river, trying to understand what had happened. That creature, that thing from the crater, its machine must have had some kind of weapon. No, it wasn't a machine, any more than an insect was. The thing inside was more like an organ than an individual, and it lived inside an armored shell perfectly suited for its biological needs. That flash of light? It must have been a burst of weaponized bioluminescence, charged and strengthened by the lens at the front of its armored body like a magnifying glass. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, and decided I had found a distraction good enough to keep me alive for a few extra minutes. As I struggled in vain against my locked seatbelt, then reached out to search the glove box for something sharp, I tried to make myself focus on the same train of thought. If they were arthropods, how could they have grown that large? The hydraulic pressure on the legs must have been enormous. Maybe the steam inside wasn't formed from water at all, but some specialized gas from burning fluids stored in organs in the legs. I pulled a pocket knife from the glove box and opened it, then started to saw at my seatbelt. Halfway through, I saw the roof of my car begin to sag. Why did I hear dripping water? At that size, how did they feed? How did they reproduce? They had traveled here, probably propelled by the same hydraulic pressure that let them move. And I began to wonder if I hadn't been more right than I thought in thinking of their shells as vehicles. If they could exit them and survive outside them for even a short time, maybe that was how they fed and mated. Maybe the swollen squids and the gigantic crabs had started as different animals, endosymbiotically linked over millennia until they had evolved into one united species of complex megafauna. And if they were the apex predators of their world, and what else could they be, then maybe they'd hunted their world into extinction. Maybe that's why they'd come to ours. I tore off the slashed-apart seatbelt and reached behind me for the headrest, pulling it off and brandishing the metal prongs on its bottom like a pair of batons. I only had one shot at this, and if I surrendered back to panic, I knew I wouldn't make it. But the most important discovery in the history of the human race was happening just above water, and I'd be damned if a little thing like drowning was going to make me miss it. I waited for a moment, trying to catch my breath enough that I could take a deep breath in. It wouldn't do me any good to run out of air 10 feet from the surface. How did they reproduce? Did they have a cloaca like birds and sharks? Or did they spore? Or spawn, like salmon? They were arthropods, sure, but what else were they? The answers were above me, and if I could make it up there, I had a front row seat. If I played my cards right, my name could be in science textbooks for the next 200 years. I could go on talk shows and do interviews for public interest science stories on bullshit news channels for the rest of my life. All I had to do was live through it. I swung the headrest into the driver's side window, leaving a spider web crack, and got ready for the water to come flooding in. I knew I had to wait for the car to fill, or I'd exhaust myself fighting against the flow of the water, but wait, when the woman in the car smashed her window, was she wearing her seatbelt? The window burst inward with a torrent of heavy water, knocking me out of my seat and into the passenger side door. I struggled to keep from flipping over as water poured into the car, trying to keep the image of the limp bodies in the SUV from repeating in my mind. The water churned up over the pedals and rose towards the seats as I pulled my legs up, ready to spring off the cushions and out the window. But as the water rose up around my shoes and over my ankles, I felt panic rising in my gut. The animal mind, the reptilian part of my brain, screamed at me as the water rose up around my waist, and my plan to keep my breath steady had already failed by the time it was swirling at the bottom of my neck. It would be over my mouth soon, then above my nose, and once that happened, there was no way to be sure how much time I had. At the last second, I took a deep breath. The water rose over my nose, then my eyes, and I pressed one hand against the roof of the car so I could feel the exact second it was full. When the water stopped moving, I hunched down and sprang off the seat, tucking my head and hands in as my shoulder smashed out what was left of the window. I shot out into the open river, then pushed off of the bottom and frantically swam up towards the surface. As the last of my gasped breath left my nose and my vision started to blur, I was 15 feet away, then 10, then 5. I slowly swam towards the closer bank, pulling one aching leg behind me as I kicked with the other. I clawed at the mud on the shore, dragged myself up and out of the water, and when I reached the grass, I collapsed face down. The sound of distant screams and massive, booming footsteps faded as my eyes fluttered closed. I don't know how long I laid there, but it was dark when I woke up. The heart-pounding adrenaline had settled into a searing headache, and all of my muscles were on fire as I pushed myself to my feet. I staggered past the crumbling end of the collapsed bridge and started into town. By now, the screams had gone silent, but I could hear fires burning out of control and the distant sound of birds. The town of Horse Hill was bright red. The buildings, those collapsed and the more or less intact, were covered in thick, red vines, twisting and gnarled around their bases like crimson poison ivy. The red-lined streets were dotted with half-melted cars, some with human-shaped smears inside them, and wherever the red weeds seemed to coalesce into a flowering bulb, I thought I could make out the shape of a body beneath its surface. I heard something hard crunch under my shoe and lifted it up. There, tangled in the red weed, was a diamond ring. The metal was stained a deep crimson, and the band looked to be half melted. Why did it look so familiar? I stared down at it, thinking it over. I had seen it this morning, hadn't I? One of the waitresses at the diner was wearing it. But which one? Was it the owner? Or... I scrambled out of the street like a cockroach under a kitchen light, tearing sticky tangles of red weed away from an overhanging balcony that was shadowy enough to hide under. The massive tripod emerged from between the buildings and strode down the street, its long, spindly legs rotating on a bulb under its sloping, cyclopean head. It dragged countless strings of the red weed behind it, sliding along the cracked street until they stuck and tore away. I watched the thing stride past me in silent, horrified awe, acutely aware of how a plankton must feel watching a whale. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and the most terrifying. I stumbled out of my hiding place and slowly followed it, numbly staring as the strings of radiant red trailing behind it gleamed in the setting sun like the back of a wedding dress. It was a god, a living, terraforming machine, and it had converted an entire town to an alien landscape in a single afternoon. Then, as a shadow spread across the street, I realized with holy terror that it wasn't alone. I turned to run as a second tripod rose above the buildings, then staggered on my hyperextended leg and tripped over a fleshy bulb in a tangle of red weed. My hand plunged down through the thin flesh and into the liquid-filled bulb as I fell, and as I pulled it out and crawled back, I realized that I had made the wrong assumption about the red weed's swollen fruit. There was a body inside the bulging pocket of wet flesh, but it wasn't a human being. It was one of them, a small, round, and squirming thing the size of a yoga ball, with a half-formed beak and a throng of writhing tentacles. It opened its mouth to cry out, and I shot my hand to cover it, stifling the infant creature's first breath as its tentacles lashed at my arm. I felt a sudden burst of burning steam hit my palm, and I bit my lip to keep from screaming, then reached out with my other hand and strengthened my grip. I held on through the pain as the shadow of the second tripod moved across the sky and blotted out the setting sun. And just before it was gone, the wriggling thing in the bulb stopped moving. It slumped out of the liquid sack and flattened on the ground like a popped beach ball as I staggered back, clutching my burning hand. True, alien life had come to Earth. Complex megafauna, endosymbiotes, arthropods. And I had strangled the firstborn in its crib. I stumbled through the streets, eyeing the red weed for more of the fleshy bulbs as I moved towards the park where the first one had landed. There were too many to count, growing on the sides of buildings or over the tops of cars, and when I reached the edge of the grass of the park, I collapsed to my knees in despair. Behind a fountain smothered in the red vines, the crater had expanded, lined with thorny tangles of red and stretching down further into the earth than I could see with the naked eye. One of the huge machines was bent over it, reaching inside with a pair of thin, lashing tendrils to do some inexplicable work. And as I stared at it for a few long minutes, the image that kept returning to my mind was a mother bird fretting over a clutch of newborns. It didn't seem happy, exactly. Not the way we knew it, but it looked content. They had traveled so long to get here, shot themselves like arrows into the cold and the dark of space in search of a new way of life. And who was I to say they hadn't found it? In only one day, the hell of the human race had become heaven, a Garden of Eden, and soon, Earth's new generation would open their eyes to look up at unfamiliar stars.
Act 3. The Astronomer.
We have to get out of here.
What about the others?
Michelle took off running. Cooper's, I don't know, he's gone. If we stay here, we're gonna die.
But there's nowhere to go. How can we?
The church has a storm cellar, right? A tornado shelter? We have to try. Please, Mr. Ogilvy, we have to try. Come on.
As Kay pulled me through town, endless thoughts of fear and confusion filled my mind. We fled, surrounded by suffering and death, until she had broken and I had pulled myself together, and it took everything I had left in me to get her to the church. I wasn't sure if I should worry more for her safety or for Father Nathaniel's, but I knew there wasn't a safer place on earth for either of them to be than down in the shelter with each other. They were good people, kind, the rare sort of folks that knew how to balance taking care of others and taking care of themselves. Kay had always been smart, and if anyone was going to make it through this, it'd be her. By the time I made it home, halfway up the mountain, the sound of screams had faded into the distance. I did my best to explain what was going on to Mrs. Burton, stammering and covered in sweat and red dust. And although she didn't quite understand, I managed to convince her to pack up and leave town for the day. She had always been Sarah's best friend, ever since they wore the same dress to their first day of kindergarten all those years ago. They hadn't gone more than a week without seeing each other since, and after the diagnosis, she had come over almost every day. Before I could get her out of the house, she asked if Sarah and I wanted to go with her. I told her we'd be right behind her, just as soon as I had packed up some important papers from the safe and some savings hidden in my office. God help me, I lied to a scared old woman. When Mrs. Burton finally left, I closed and locked the door, then went into the living room where Sarah was sitting watching television. Footage of burning cities and lights in the sky flashed across the screen, and I could see in Sarah's eyes that she couldn't quite grasp it. But she was beautiful as she'd ever been. Sarah?
Oh, it's you. Did Patty leave? We were just going to play cards.
She had to go home.
Oh, well, it was nice of her to visit anyway. Haven't seen her in years, not since... Was it a wedding, or...
I waited as she tried to remember. It never got easier, waiting for her to lose her train of thought. But it was better than having to explain why she couldn't remember over and over. Finally, she tutted and shook her head and turned back to the television.
I don't know why I'm watching this anyway. Can't follow any of it. Too much going on.
That's all right. We'll turn it off for now. I love you, Sarah.
I love you too.
Can I ask you something?
Of course.
Do you remember when you first got sick, you were crying in the truck in the parking lot at the doctor's? And I just sat there and held you. And we must have sat there for almost an hour. And then we went and got burgers on the way home. And as we sat on the porch and ate them, we talked about how we were going to let folks know about the diagnosis, about how we were going to make sure you were taken care of. And then all of a sudden you got quiet. and you wouldn't even look at me, and you made me promise you something. Do you remember what that was?
I'm sorry,
That's all right. I didn't think you would, but you asked me to do something, and I swore to you that I would, and I just couldn't. I couldn't do it. I knew you wanted me to, but you made me swear. You made me put my hand on my heart and swear like I was pledging to the flag that if you got too confused, if you weren't you anymore because of the disease, that I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I made that promise, but I never thought. I figured if the time came, you wouldn't remember making me swear to it anyway, so I'm sorry, Sarah, because I let you down. And I've been letting you down for months, years probably, because I just couldn't bear to be without you.
I'm sorry, but I don't remember.
I know, and that's all right. Did you eat lunch? Well, are you hungry? Just sit tight. I'm going to go get washed up, and then I'll make us some sandwiches. And then we can play some cards if you want to. Then we got to get going, but there's no rush. I heard her turn the TV back on while I was in the kitchen, and when I came back out with the sandwiches, she was watching it with confusion and concern.
What's the world coming to? Honestly.
The world's left us behind, Sarah. It just kept turning till we fell off. That's not the worst thing, you know. Mankind has done a pretty damn good job of messing it all up. Might as well give somebody else a shot. Here, I cut the crust off just like you like.
Will wonders never cease? Monsters falling from the sky?
Just like the old song, huh? Life on Mars.
I guess.
About what we were talking about before.
What were we talking about before?
Well, never mind. We sat and ate our sandwiches, then turned the volume down and played cards. The whole time I kept eyeing the screen, watching as more and more live footage from around the world turned to static. Those things were everywhere. Every city, in every country, on every continent in the world. And they were winning. Somewhere near the end of the game, the TV went black. I told Sarah we were going on a trip, then wrote a letter for Kay to stick to our door. If anybody was going to make it, it'd be her, and she deserved to know what happened to us. As I wrote, I thought about the world that was dying, the one that had thrown us off as it spun toward a new set of caretakers. Hopefully they'll do a better job of it. When the note was done, I got Sarah and I dressed up to travel. I took one last look at the empty house before I closed the door, thinking of all the good years we had spent there. But good times didn't last forever, any more than rotting wood or aging bodies. And soon, all that would be left was a free-floating memory with no one around to pull it back down to earth. I pinned the note to the front door and walked with Sarah to the garage, then sat down in the truck next to her and smiled. She smiled back as I started the engine, and she didn't even seem to notice that I didn't press the button to open the garage door.
Where are we going?
Somewhere beautiful. Real quiet, too. Just you and me.
That sounds lovely. Well, are we going?
In a minute. I want to ask you something. Do you remember our first date? It's okay if you don't, but I want to know.
We, the fair, right?
Yes, that's right. And I spent all my money trying to win you that stupid stuffed whale, and you didn't even care. You just smiled at me, trying your best not to laugh, while I got madder and madder. And finally, when I ran out of change, you just took my hand and gave me a kiss on the cheek for trying. I remember I'd just gotten that telescope, and when we were on the Ferris wheel, I wouldn't stop pointing out what stars were out above us. And finally he just said, I don't care what they're called. I just like looking at them. And then later on that night, we sat at the top of the hill where everybody went to mess around, and we just laid in the back of my truck and stared up at the sky. That night, I knew I was going to make you mine. Do you remember any of that?
The important parts.
You know, I'm a little tired. Why don't we just sit here for a minute?
Can we hold hands?
Until the stars go out. It wouldn't take long, not once the exhaust filled up the car, and it wasn't much of a loss after all, only a few years short of a full life. And we'd gotten lucky enough to live to see the end of an age. The world would keep turning no matter who was standing on it, and the last thing it needed were 2 more mouths to feed. I'd fulfilled my promise, even if the human race had squandered theirs. But the mind itself can make a hell of heaven, and more importantly, a heaven of hell. Dying together, that wasn't so bad. Hell is living alone.
War of the Worlds Part 2 was written and directed by Jonathan Inbody, and adapted from the novel The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. It was edited by Jeffrey Lavin, with music composed and performed by Samantha Hunt. Michelle was played by Andrea Inbody, Cooper was played by Justin Pope, and Mr. Ogilvy was played by Dean Puleo. Sean C. Sanders played Dean, Samantha Hunt played Kay, and Kimberly Lewis played Sarah Ogilvy.
Gray Matter is a Word Search Media production. Any similarities to real people, places, or things is purely coincidental. Be kind. Rewind.